Hi everyone, this is Morgan, and in this video I'm going to show you how to create a lumen print. I'm actually going to show you 3 different ways to approach this. Lumens are in many ways one of the simplest alternative process techniques we'll be looking at, but there are a surprising number of different approaches. So just to establish basics, lumen prints are made by taking sheets of unexposed black and white photo paper and placing objects, or sometimes negatives, on top of that paper. And that's very similar to the process of making a photogram if you're familiar with that. If you are new to analog photography, a photogram, or sometimes called a rayogram, is a picture produced with photographic materials such as light-sensitive paper, but not using a camera. So in this image, you can actually see we have the kind of silhouette outline of a cassette tape that was just placed directly onto photosensitive paper. So again, no cameras at all involved in creating this image. So a few factors go into making a lumen print successfully. One is choosing photographic paper that will work well for the process. The second is UV exposure. So in our case, that refers to the sun. Next, you want to pick engaging subject matter or objects to place on the paper. Ideally, these objects will have some moisture content. And finally, the only remaining factor is deciding whether or not to fix your lumen at the end, which is something we'll discuss later on. The first thing you'll want to grab is enlarging paper, and this is paper that is typically used in the darkroom to make prints. So if you're new to analog photography, this will be a new area. One interesting thing about these papers is that they expire. If they're not kept in a cool, relatively dry place, the papers don't have a long lifespan and they have color shifts and just different wonky things happen. So the cool thing for us when we're working with lumen is this process is a great reason to use expired paper, and we have some lying around the lab. So while I show a new box of Ilford paper in this photo, I would highly suggest you take this as an excuse to use free expired paper materials that we already have in the lab. If you want to take them away from the lab, you can go into a dark room, put them in one of our black light tight bags, and just remove just a few sheets to make a lumen. For reference, I use this paper for the demo, and it is very old. I'm going to show you how to prep your clip frame. This whole step should be done in darkness or at least really dim lighting. I'm doing it in slightly brighter lighting just to show you the process more clearly, but remember to prepare your subject and clip frame in dim lighting. So if this is the first time you're building a clip frame, I'm going to walk you through it. It's a process we will keep returning to, so it's good to learn it. First, you'll have your backing board, which for most of you will be a sheet of plywood. On top of that, you'll put your enlarging paper, and I'm just using sketch paper here to kind of remind you that this should eventually be done in dim lighting with the photosensitive darkroom paper that you'll be using. On top of that, you'll put your subject matter, and again, consider moisture content when choosing subject matter. Fresh plants, fruit, and other moisture-heavy materials work really well. So in just a minute, I'll show you plants and basically weeds I gathered from my garden. I picked them right before exposing, and that works really well because they're still really full of moisture. If you let them dry out, they won't lumen as well. On top of your subject, you'll place some glass, gather some clamps, and then clamp at 4 corners of the piece so you're ready for exposure. You'll see I'm trying to place the clamps off the paper so that they're not interfering with my exposure. If I clamped on top of the paper, the little clamp edges would show up in my lumen print. So next we'll expose. So this involves placing this whole assemblage out into the sun, since the sun is our UV exposure tool, for typically around 30 minutes to 2 hours. That's a pretty big range, so I wanted to talk a little bit about how to determine exposure, or at least the factors that go into exposure, since it's so complicated. So there are 3 kind of general factors that go into UV exposure. These are all basically different ways of saying you need to factor in how bright the sun is. So is it sunny, partly sunny, or cloudy? How close are we to summer when the light from the sun is at its strongest? And also, what time of day is it? Solar noon for us here in Menominee is at around 1 in September, and it'll be closer to noon by December. But in general, you're going to have the best luck doing UV exposure outside between 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. For lumen prints, we also need to factor in the paper. Different papers will expose at different rates depending on their brand, finish, age, etc. Also, some people like to just really cook their lumens and leave them out for 8, 24 hours to get really extreme results. But again, typically, exposures run between 30 minutes and 2 hours. Normally, if you look kind of near the edges of your subject matter, you can start to see their silhouettes. You can start to get a sense of how your lumen is cooking if you pay close attention to it. Obviously, you want to leave it alone and let it be still as much as possible so you're not getting shaking. One of the things I like to look for is condensation, and here in this close-up you can see condensation is a good sign that we're going to get some of that interesting moisture content and have it create those colors that are so interesting in final lumen prints. So in my case, I waited 2 hours, and you can see me taking this back into dimmer lighting and kind of unboxing the whole thing, slowly peeling the plant matter off of the material. I should add, this for me typically never smells good. It's not a rotting smell, but it's like the peppery smell before the rotting smell. So you can see I have my lumen print, and I'm going to scan it as soon as possible. Since I haven't done anything to make this archival, it's still photosensitive. It still is being exposed by light all the time. So scanning it as soon as possible preserves those colors. This is what I get initially. And after scanning, I want to correct for color exposure and contrast, because typically lumens don't scan with their true colors. The colors of lumens are really subtle and I think cool. Right now, the background of this print looks like a pretty definitive gray, and what I was looking at was much more close to like a rich, almost like mauve that still had some grays in it, but the scan sort of robbed it of its dynamism. So I'm bringing it back here in Photoshop by just playing around with saturation levels. You can see I'm specifically going and pumping up the yellows, which I had kind of lost the most. And in general, I would just encourage you to look at your print, try to work with it in Photoshop to make sure it's as color accurate as possible to the print at that point in its life, since we know it's going to change. I've also seen a lot of artists who like to invert lumens, so I'm demoing that process here in Photoshop now. It really does give it's an interesting effect. Some people prefer to just have this as their final lumen display. You see me turning on and off the invert layer. This is a choice you can make for yourself. You can absolutely have your final lumen quote unquote print be a scan that you've inverted and then reprinted. At this point, you have a choice, which is, are you going to fix the print or are you not going to fix the print? For some of you who are new to analog processing, that might require a little bit of explanation, because fixing is a term that's specific to darkroom photography. When you're making prints in the darkroom, they go through 3 chemical baths. First, they're put in the developer, which makes the image appear. Then they go in the stop bath. And then finally, they're put in the fixer, which makes the paper no longer light sensitive and allows prints to be viewed in regular light. So that's what's going to happen here too. If you decide to fix your lumen, they'll be archival and they'll be able to be viewed in regular light with minimal fading. The hitch here is fixing changes the color of lumens. Also, you'll need to wash prints after fixing them, and that will remove some of the details that I have here, like the plant matter that's still physically on my lumen, which is kind of cool. I actually like that as part of it. For some examples of how fixing changes the color of lumens, you can see here are some before and afters. So typically, lumens after being fixed lose some of their saturation, or it's skewed a little to the warmer side of the spectrum. So sometimes it can be a cool aesthetic choice. Just know what's going to happen. After scanning or documenting your initial lumen print, it's a good idea to store it in a light-tight envelope or box until you can take it to the lab to be fixed and washed. This hopefully gives you the best of both worlds, where you have the initial scan showing the original color of the lumen, but you also have an archival copy. I should mention that some artists, like Kira Schmidt, who I'll talk about in just a little bit, actually never choose to fix lumen prints. You can see she actually has plant matter still left on her paper. She knows it's going to change and fade over time, and that's part of the concept for her. With your initial lumen prints, since they're some of the first alternative process prints you're going to make, I would probably encourage most of you to fix them just so you have options for later down the line, but remember, you have choices here. I also wanted to at least quickly show you how the process could be done with fruit. I didn't slice this apple especially thin, but they were still thin enough to produce some relatively interesting results. So if you've gotten to this stage in the process, you've completed a cameraless photograph. I really like in this one how the moisture content of the apples really kind of is allowed in some places of the print. So the last technique I'm going to show you is making a lumen with water and algae, which is kind of an interesting approach since obviously water and algae have high moisture contents. I was hugely inspired in this by the work of, again, Kara Schmidt, who we've talked about. This is actually her making one of her prints using water. And one of the ways she uses this is she'll make lumen prints that are kind of reinserted back into the landscapes where they were made. So it was cool enough that I wanted to try it. You can see this is me here near Lake Menomin, and I wanted to do a few different examples of how this process could work. So I have a bunch of test strips and one full print. I think my exposure time landed around 5 minutes. Sometimes I had the photosensitive side down, sometimes the photosensitive side was up, and you can really see the effects on the ones with the photosensitive side up quite clearly. It was pretty easy to watch them and see the effects when I at least had some with the photosensitive side up. So after exposure, I placed some of the prints in black bags, some just in the cardboard containers for the photo paper, and took them home and immediately scanned this, which I think for a first pancake actually turned out pretty darn well. You can see at the top where it's really white, that's where the algae was. You can see the effects of the water. You can see little places where the duckweed was really prominent. I should say that in addition to needing to transport these in light tight containers, I also needed to let them dry out in a dark space so that they weren't dripping wet when I put them into the scanner. Especially with the test prints, you can see the duckweed is still definitively on some of these, which I think is kind of cool. So, in this video, we've talked about 3 different ways to approach the relatively simple lumen print, exposing with plant matter, fruit, and with water and algae. So please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you for making it to the end here. Good luck.